The truth has a strange way of introducing itself when you least expect it. The ballroom of the Sterling Children's Foundation shimmered beneath hundreds of crystal lights, transforming the historic Chicago hotel into a sea of gold and silver reflections. Wealthy donors, business leaders, educators, and community advocates filled the enormous room, their conversations blending with the soft music drifting from a live orchestra near the stage. At the center of the evening stood Alexander Sterling, the 38-year-old CEO of Sterling Global and one of the most recognizable business figures in America. Cameras followed him wherever he went. Financial magazines praised his leadership. Investors trusted his judgment. To the public, he represented confidence, discipline, and success. Tonight, he had agreed to present the Young Innovator of the Year award, an honor recognizing exceptional achievement among elementary and middle school students. As Alexander waited backstage, event coordinators reviewed the program while volunteers guided children into position. Everything felt routine, predictable, controlled, the way Alexander preferred it. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and welcomed the audience. Applause echoed through the ballroom. Names were announced. Scholarships were awarded. Smiles filled giant screens suspended above the stage. Then came the final category of the evening. The audience quieted as a short video introduced the winner, an 8-year-old boy recognized for designing a low-cost water conservation project for community gardens. Alexander glanced casually toward the screen. At first, he paid little attention. Then the boy's face appeared. Something inside him shifted instantly. The sensation arrived without warning. A strange tightening in his chest. A sudden inability to look away. The screen displayed photographs of the child working on his project, speaking with teachers, and presenting his ideas to judges. The ballroom continued watching proudly. Alexander felt frozen. When the video ended, the host smiled warmly. Please welcome this year's Young Innovator of the Year, Elijah Carter. Applause erupted throughout the room. Alexander turned toward the side entrance of the stage. A small figure emerged beneath the spotlight. The boy walked confidently toward the center platform, carrying himself with a calm self-assurance unusual for someone so young. Alexander stared. The distance between them could not hide what he was seeing. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same slight tilt of the head. Even the way the boy adjusted his jacket felt strangely familiar. It was like watching an old photograph come to life. The audience saw an intelligent young student. Alexander saw something impossible. Elijah reached the microphone and smiled politely as the applause settled. For several seconds, Alexander forgot entirely that he was supposed to be standing on stage beside him. The event coordinator quietly touched his arm, pulling him back to reality. Alexander stepped forward, forcing himself to maintain composure. Years of public appearances helped hide his shock, but inside, questions had already begun racing through his mind. He handed the award to Elijah and offered a congratulatory handshake. The moment their hands met, Alexander felt another wave of disbelief. Up close, the resemblance became even stronger. Elijah thanked him and turned toward the audience. Then he began his speech. His voice was clear and steady. He spoke about science, community gardens, and helping neighborhoods use resources more efficiently. The crowd listened attentively, yet Alexander barely heard the words. He found himself studying every expression, every gesture, every movement. The boy smiled exactly the way Alexander had smiled in childhood photographs stored inside family albums. He folded one hand behind his back while speaking, a habit Alexander still carried into board meetings without realizing it. The similarities felt overwhelming. When the speech ended, the ballroom erupted into applause once again. Elijah thanked the audience and prepared to leave the stage. Then Alexander heard the host ask a simple question. Would you like to thank anyone special tonight? Elijah smiled immediately. My mom. The audience responded warmly. She always tells me that doing the right thing matters more than being important, Elijah continued. Everything I learned started with her. The sincerity in his voice touched everyone in the room. Then the giant camera screens shifted toward the audience, searching for his mother. A woman stood slowly near the center section of the ballroom. The moment Alexander saw her, the world around him seemed to disappear. Naomi Carter. 8 years vanished in a heartbeat. The same woman he had loved. The same woman who had disappeared without explanation. The same woman he had searched for before eventually convincing himself she was gone forever. She stood beneath the ballroom lights with quiet dignity, applauding her son. Her expression carried calm strength, not surprise, not fear, as though she had already prepared herself for this moment long before it arrived. Alexander could not move, could not speak, could barely breathe, because standing between them was a boy who looked exactly like him, carried the last name of the woman who had vanished from his life, and possessed an age that matched a timeline Alexander suddenly found impossible to ignore. The applause continued long after Elijah stepped away from the microphone, but Alexander Sterling barely heard it. The sound seemed distant now, buried beneath the questions crashing through his mind. Around him, guests smiled, stood, and congratulated one another on another successful evening. Cameras flashed. Donors exchanged handshakes. Volunteers guided children toward the reception hall. Yet Alexander remained frozen near the stage, watching Naomi Carter across the ballroom. 8 years. 8 years since he had last seen her. 8 years since she disappeared from his life without warning, explanation, or goodbye. He had spent months searching for answers back then. Calls had gone unanswered. Emails had received no response. Addresses had led nowhere. Eventually, even hope had become exhausted. Tonight, standing beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, he suddenly found himself staring at the woman who had haunted his memories for nearly a decade. And standing beside her was a boy whose existence made no sense. Elijah moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone completely unaware of the storm he had created. Guests stopped him to offer congratulations. Teachers smiled proudly. Community leaders praised his achievement. Every few moments Alexander caught another glimpse of the child. The resemblance remained impossible to ignore. It was not one feature. It was dozens. The eyes, the smile, the posture. Even the way he listened carefully before answering questions reminded Alexander of himself at that age. Logic urged caution. Emotion ignored it completely. The reception began in an adjoining ballroom filled with round tables, elegant floral arrangements, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of refreshments while students displayed projects around the room. Alexander should have been speaking with donors and board members. Instead, his attention remained fixed on a single corner of the event space. Naomi stood beside Elijah near a display showcasing youth innovation programs. She wore a simple dark green dress, elegant without trying to attract attention. The years had changed her, but not in the ways he expected. She seemed stronger now, more certain of herself. The uncertainty he once remembered in her eyes had been replaced by quiet confidence. Several times their eyes met across the room. Each time, Naomi looked away first, not out of fear, but as though she had already decided that certain conversations would happen only when she was ready. Alexander finally excused himself from a group of investors and moved through the crowd. His pulse quickened with every step. For the first time in years, he felt nervous approaching someone. Boardrooms never intimidated him. Billion-dollar negotiations never unsettled him. Yet a woman standing beside a young boy somehow managed both. Before he reached them, Elijah spotted him. The boy smiled immediately. "Mr. Sterling." Alexander returned the smile automatically. "Congratulations again. Your presentation was impressive." Elijah's face brightened. "Thank you. I worked on it for almost 6 months." Alexander laughed softly. It showed. Up close, the similarities seemed even stronger. The boy's expressions shifted with the same subtle movements Alexander saw in his own mirror every morning. For a moment, he found himself wondering whether anyone else noticed. Then Elijah glanced toward Naomi. "Mom, this is Mr. Sterling." Naomi met Alexander's gaze. The distance between past and present seemed to collapse instantly. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, she offered a polite nod. "Congratulations on the event. It looked successful." Her voice sounded exactly as he remembered. Calm, warm, controlled. Alexander struggled to hide his emotions. Naomi. Just hearing her name aloud felt strange. She gave another small nod, but offered nothing more. Elijah looked between them. "You know each other?" The question hung briefly in the air. Naomi answered before Alexander could. "A long time ago." The simplicity of the response somehow made everything feel heavier. Nearby, guests continued laughing and talking, completely unaware of the tension hidden inside the conversation. Alexander looked at Elijah again. "How old are you?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Elijah answered immediately. 8. Alexander felt something tighten inside his chest. 8. Exactly 8. The number echoed through his mind. Elijah smiled politely and continued describing his project, but Alexander found it increasingly difficult to focus. Every answer only deepened the mystery. Every glance raised new questions. Eventually, an event coordinator approached Naomi regarding another presentation. She thanked the woman and turned toward her son. "We should go." Elijah nodded. Before leaving, he looked back at Alexander. "Maybe I will see you again." The boy's smile carried effortless sincerity. Alexander managed a smile of his own. "I hope so." Then they disappeared into the crowd. Alexander remained standing exactly where they left him. Across the room, city lights reflected against the glass windows like scattered stars. For years, he believed the most important mysteries in life involved business, strategy, and success. Tonight, for the first time, he realized the most important mystery in his life was walking out of the ballroom beside Naomi Carter. Alexander Sterling did not sleep that night. Long. After the charity gala ended and Chicago's skyline faded into the darkness beyond his penthouse windows, he remained awake, staring at a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar. His phone rested untouched on the coffee table beside him. Messages from board members, investors, and friends continued arriving throughout the evening, congratulating him on another successful foundation event. He ignored every one of them. His mind remained fixed on a single image. Elijah Carter standing beneath the spotlight. The boy's smile. The boy's voice. The boy's face. Every detail returned with unsettling clarity. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Alexander found himself standing inside his home office. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with awards, photographs, and business achievements collected throughout his career. Yet his attention settled on something much older. A framed childhood photograph resting near the back of a shelf. Alexander removed it carefully and carried it to his desk. The photograph showed him at 8 years old during a school science competition. He stared at the image for several minutes. The resemblance was undeniable. Not similar. Not coincidental. Unmistakable. He placed the photograph beside a brochure from the gala featuring Elijah's picture. The comparison made his pulse quicken. The same eyes. The same smile. The same expression. Logic urged restraint. Emotion refused to cooperate. By sunrise, Alexander had reached a decision. He needed answers. Not assumptions. Not theories. Answers. The following morning, Sterling Global's executive headquarters buzzed with activity as usual. Elevators moved constantly between floors. Meetings filled every conference room. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying schedules and reports. Yet Alexander struggled to focus on any of it. During a strategic planning session worth hundreds of millions of dollars, he caught himself staring through the glass walls of the boardroom instead of listening to financial projections. Eventually, his chief operating officer paused mid-presentation. "Alexander, are you all right?" The question pulled him back to reality. He offered a brief apology and asked the team to continue. But even then, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. Later that afternoon, he called his closest friend and longtime attorney, Benjamin Foster, into his office. Benjamin had known Alexander for nearly 15 years. More importantly, he was one of the few people willing to speak honestly when everyone else chose diplomacy. The moment Benjamin entered, he noticed something was wrong. "You look like you have not slept." Alexander managed a tired smile. "I have not." Benjamin sat down across from him. "What happened?" For several seconds, Alexander considered where to begin. Finally, he slid the gala brochure across the desk. Benjamin looked down at Elijah's photograph, then back at Alexander, then down again. His expression changed immediately. "Well," Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Exactly." Benjamin studied the image more carefully. "How old?" 8. The attorney raised an eyebrow. Neither man spoke for a moment. The implication hung heavily in the room. Eventually, Benjamin broke the silence. "And the mother?" Alexander turned toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. "Naomi Carter." Benjamin recognized the name instantly. Years earlier, he had witnessed the aftermath of her disappearance. He remembered the unanswered questions, the frustration, the confusion. "You saw her?" Alexander nodded. "She was there." Benjamin exhaled slowly. "That complicates things." Alexander laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. That is one way to describe it. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Benjamin encouraged caution. Similarity alone proved nothing. Timelines could be misleading. Emotions could distort judgment. Alexander agreed with every point. Yet none of the logic erased what he had seen. Before leaving, Benjamin offered one final observation. If Naomi wanted you to know, she could have told you last night. The statement lingered after the attorney left. Alexander remained seated, staring at the city below. Why had Naomi stayed silent? Why disappear 8 years ago? Why reappear now? Why bring Elijah to an event where their paths might cross? The questions multiplied with every passing hour. That evening, unable to resist any longer, Alexander opened his laptop and began searching public records. What started as simple curiosity quickly became obsession. Educational awards, community projects, school science competitions, newspaper articles, local interviews. Elijah appeared everywhere. Each accomplishment painted the picture of an exceptional young boy. Then Alexander found something else. An article published 2 years earlier about a neighborhood education initiative. Beside Elijah stood Naomi. The accompanying profile described her as founder of a nonprofit organization supporting underserved families throughout Illinois. Alexander stared at the photograph. Naomi looked happy, strong, accomplished. The woman who had vanished from his life had built an entirely new world. And somehow, despite years of searching, he had never found it. As darkness settled outside his office windows, Alexander closed the article and leaned back in silence. The mystery surrounding Elijah had only grown larger. Yet one truth had become impossible to ignore. Somewhere within Naomi's story existed the answer to a question Alexander was becoming increasingly afraid to ask. 8 years earlier, long before mystery and unanswered questions entered their lives, Alexander Sterling believed he knew exactly what his future would look like. At 30 years old, he was already being described as one of the most promising young executives in the country. Sterling Global was expanding rapidly. Investors competed for meetings. Business publications featured his photograph on their covers. Every door seemed to open before he reached it. Yet the most important thing in his life had nothing to do with boardrooms, financial reports, or corporate success. It was Naomi Carter. On a bright September afternoon, sunlight spilled across the campus of a community development conference where they first met. Naomi had been invited to speak about neighborhood education initiatives while Alexander attended as a sponsor representing Sterling Global. Their worlds appeared completely different. Alexander spent his days discussing growth strategies and market expansion. Naomi spent hers helping families access resources, education, and opportunities. Yet from the beginning, conversation came easily. What started as a brief exchange after a panel discussion stretched into nearly 2 hours. They talked about books, family, goals, and the kind of impact they hoped to leave on the world. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself speaking honestly rather than professionally. Naomi had a way of making people feel heard. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed completely uninterested in his public image. She cared about the person behind it. Over the following months, they grew closer. Some of Alexander's happiest memories came from ordinary moments rather than extravagant ones. Saturday mornings spent walking through local farmers markets. Quiet dinners in neighborhood restaurants where nobody recognized him. Long conversations beside Lake Michigan while city lights reflected across the water. Naomi never treated him like a celebrity or a billionaire. She challenged him when he was wrong, encouraged him when he doubted himself, reminded him that success meant very little if it failed to improve the lives of others. Slowly, she became the one person capable of cutting through the noise surrounding his life. Even Alexander's closest friends noticed the difference. He laughed more, worked less obsessively, smiled without forcing it. For the first time since becoming CEO, he began imagining a future that included more than business plans and shareholder meetings. Naomi felt it too. Their relationship grew steadily, built not on dramatic gestures, but on trust. They discussed dreams, fears, and possibilities. They talked about traveling, about building a family someday, about creating a life that balanced ambition with purpose. Neither realized how quickly everything would change. One snowy evening during the winter before everything fell apart, Alexander stood in Naomi's apartment kitchen attempting to cook dinner. The effort produced mixed results. Smoke briefly filled the room after he forgot a skillet on the stove. Naomi laughed so hard she nearly dropped her glass of water. Alexander remembered the sound vividly years later. The warmth of it, the ease of it. Eventually, they abandoned cooking altogether and ordered takeout. Sitting together on the living room floor, sharing food from cardboard containers while snow drifted outside the windows, they talked about the future again. This time, the conversation felt different. More serious. More real. Alexander reached for her hand and told her something he had never admitted before. He was tired of living a life designed entirely around expectations. Naomi squeezed his hand gently. She understood. That night, neither made grand promises. Neither discussed timelines or plans. Yet both quietly imagined a future together. As spring arrived, their relationship deepened even further. They attended charity events, community programs, and family gatherings. Naomi met people from Alexander's professional world. Alexander became involved in some of Naomi's nonprofit projects. Despite the differences in their backgrounds, they complemented one another naturally. She grounded him. He supported her ambitions. For a while, everything seemed possible. Looking back years later, Alexander would often return to those memories. Not because they were perfect, but because they were genuine. Before complications, before misunderstandings, before disappearances, before regret, there had simply been two people building something meaningful together. And on a warm evening in early summer, as they sat watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and orange, neither one could have imagined that the life growing quietly between them was already about to change everything. 3 weeks after that summer evening by the lake, Naomi Carter found herself sitting alone in a small medical office on the north side of Chicago, staring at a piece of information that had quietly changed the course of her life. Outside the window, traffic moved along busy streets while sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Inside, everything felt strangely still. The doctor spoke gently, explaining details and answering questions, but Naomi barely heard most of it. Her hand rested lightly against her stomach as a mixture of surprise, fear, and happiness settled over her. She was going to have a baby. During the drive home, emotions arrived in waves. Part of her worried about how dramatically life would change. Another part could not stop smiling. By the time she reached her apartment, excitement had begun outweighing uncertainty. She imagined Alexander's reaction. She pictured the look on his face, the questions he would ask, the plans they would make. For nearly an hour, she walked from room to room, rehearsing the conversation in her mind. That evening she called him, but his assistant explained that he had been pulled into emergency meetings related to an international expansion project. Naomi understood. Business crises came and went. There would be time. She decided to tell him in person. Over the next several days, opportunities never seemed to align. Alexander traveled constantly. New York, Dallas, San Francisco. Every conversation felt rushed between flights and meetings. Yet despite the delays, Naomi remained hopeful. Whenever they spoke, she could hear the affection in his voice. Nothing suggested the future she imagined was impossible. Then something unexpected happened. One Friday afternoon, while organizing paperwork at her nonprofit office, Naomi received a call from an unfamiliar number. The woman on the line spoke politely and introduced herself. Margaret Sterling, Alexander's mother. Naomi had met her only twice before. Both encounters had been brief and formal. Margaret requested a private meeting. Her tone revealed little. Curious but not alarmed, Naomi agreed. The following day, she arrived at an upscale hotel restaurant overlooking downtown Chicago. Soft piano music drifted through the room, while sunlight illuminated polished glass and elegant furnishings. Margaret was already seated when Naomi arrived. Impeccably dressed and perfectly composed, she looked exactly as Naomi remembered. Wealth, confidence, and control seemed to follow her naturally. She greeted Naomi with a polite smile and invited her to sit. At first, the conversation felt harmless. They discussed charity work, community programs, and Alexander's demanding schedule. Yet beneath the pleasant words, Naomi sensed something unusual. Margaret seemed less interested in conversation than observation. Eventually, the older woman folded her hands neatly on the table and looked directly at her. "You care about my son." It was not a question. Naomi nodded. "Yes." Margaret studied her carefully. "And you believe you know what kind of future he should have." The statement felt different, sharper somehow. Naomi sat quietly. Margaret continued. Alexander has responsibilities that extend far beyond personal relationships. Entire companies depend on him. Thousands of employees. Investors. International partnerships. Naomi listened without interruption. She respected Alexander's ambitions. She always had. Margaret leaned slightly forward. His future is becoming very complicated. For the first time, Naomi felt genuine unease. The conversation no longer sounded like concern. It sounded like strategy. I am not sure what that has to do with me, she replied calmly. Margaret's expression never changed. Everything. Silence settled between them. Around the restaurant, guests continued enjoying lunch, completely unaware that a life-altering conversation was unfolding nearby. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. Instinctively, her hand drifted toward her purse where she carried the ultrasound photograph she planned to show Alexander. Margaret noticed the movement. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Then, with remarkable precision, she asked a question. Is there something you have not told him yet? Naomi froze. The older woman's intelligence suddenly felt intimidating. For several seconds, neither spoke. Margaret seemed to recognize the answer before Naomi gave it. A complicated emotion crossed her face. Not surprise. Calculation. Naomi felt the atmosphere shift immediately. The lunch meeting no longer resembled a polite conversation between two women. It had become something else entirely. Something colder. Something dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical harm and everything to do with power. Margaret slowly reached for her glass of water. I think, she said carefully, there are some very important realities we need to discuss. And as Naomi sat across from the most influential woman in Alexander Sterling's life, she began to realize that the future she had been dreaming about might be facing an obstacle far greater than she ever imagined. Naomi sat silently as Margaret Sterling's words settled over the table like an approaching storm. The elegant restaurant remained filled with quiet conversation and polished professionalism, yet the atmosphere between the two women had changed completely. Margaret no longer sounded like a concerned mother. She sounded like someone accustomed to controlling outcomes. Someone who believed every problem could be solved with enough influence. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Naomi carefully chose her next words. Alexander and I care about each other. Margaret nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a fact that held little importance. I do not doubt that. She lifted her glass and took a small sip of water before continuing. But affection and compatibility are not the same thing. Naomi remained calm. What exactly are you trying to say? Margaret folded her hands. My son is entering the most important phase of his career. Several major partnerships are being negotiated. International expansion is underway. Investors are watching every move he makes. Naomi immediately understood where the conversation was heading. What surprised her was how little emotion accompanied it. Margaret was not angry. She was not cruel. She simply viewed life through a lens where people became variables inside larger strategies. You believe I would hurt his future? Margaret held her gaze. I believe complications would. The distinction felt deliberate. Naomi thought of the ultrasound photograph resting inside her purse. Her heart ached. For days she had imagined sharing joyful news with Alexander. Now she found herself sitting across from a woman discussing her future child as though it were a business risk. Margaret reached into her designer handbag and removed a sealed envelope. She placed it gently on the table between them. Naomi stared at it without touching it. What is that? Margaret's expression remained perfectly composed. An opportunity. Naomi already knew the answer before hearing it. A cold realization spread through her chest. Margaret continued speaking with remarkable calm. She explained that the money inside the agreement would allow Naomi to start over anywhere she wished. Housing, education, career support, financial security. Everything would be arranged. In exchange, she would leave Chicago and permanently end her relationship with Alexander. Naomi felt disbelief wash over her. Not because of the offer itself, but because of how casually it was delivered. As though a life could be reorganized with paperwork. As though love could be replaced by logistics. You are asking me to disappear. For the first time, Margaret hesitated. Only briefly. I am asking you to make a difficult decision. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the envelope. Then back to Margaret. Does Alexander know about this? The question finally produced a visible reaction. Margaret's gaze shifted slightly. No. The answer arrived too quickly. Naomi felt something inside her tighten. And if I tell him? Margaret's expression softened, though not with kindness. With certainty. You can try. The words carried more meaning than their simplicity suggested. Naomi understood immediately. Alexander was traveling constantly. Meetings consumed every hour of his schedule. Powerful people surrounded him. Access to him often required navigating assistants, executives, and advisors. Suddenly, obstacles she previously viewed as normal began looking different. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Naomi left the restaurant carrying the envelope she never opened. Outside, Chicago traffic moved beneath gray afternoon skies. People hurried along sidewalks, unaware that her entire future had just been placed into question. That evening, she sat alone inside her apartment. The ultrasound photograph rested on the coffee table beside the unopened envelope. For hours, she stared at both objects. One represented hope. The other represented fear. She called Alexander 3 times. Each attempt went directly to voicemail. She left a message asking him to call when possible. The following day, she tried again. No response. Another day passed. Then another. Emails remained unanswered. Text messages went unread. Rationally, Naomi understood he was traveling. Yet uncertainty had begun creeping into her thoughts. Then, 3 days after meeting Margaret, something happened that shattered her confidence entirely. An email arrived from an unfamiliar address. Attached was a short message and a photograph. The image showed Alexander attending a corporate event overseas alongside a prominent business heiress frequently mentioned in financial media. Standing together beneath flashing cameras, they appeared polished, successful, and perfectly matched. Beneath the photograph sat a single sentence. Alexander has chosen the future that makes sense. Naomi stared at the screen for a long time. Logic told her the message could be manipulation. Her heart struggled to believe otherwise. The timing felt devastating. Every unanswered call, every missed message, every growing silence suddenly seemed connected. Tears filled her eyes for the first time since leaving the restaurant. Not because she felt weak, but because hope was becoming harder to hold. Across the room, the envelope remained untouched. Yet for the first time, Naomi found herself looking at it differently. Not as an offer, as an escape. And deep inside, a terrible question began forming. What if Alexander already knew? The question haunted Naomi for weeks. What if Alexander already knew? What if every unanswered call, every ignored message, and every moment of silence had not been coincidence at all? Each morning, she woke hoping clarity would arrive. Each night, she went to sleep carrying the same uncertainty. The unopened envelope remained inside a kitchen drawer. Some days she considered throwing it away. Other days, she simply stared at it, wondering how a single object could represent both surrender and survival. Meanwhile, Alexander remained completely unaware of the storm unfolding around him. Across the country, his schedule had become even more demanding. International negotiations stretched longer than expected. Meetings filled every hour. Entire weeks disappeared beneath contracts, presentations, and travel. Several times he attempted to contact Naomi. Each time he was met with silence. At first he assumed she was busy. Then he assumed she might be upset. Eventually concern replaced confusion. One evening he stood alone inside a hotel suite overlooking San Francisco Bay and listened to another voicemail greeting. After the tone, he left a message. His voice sounded tired but sincere. He told her he missed her. He told her he wanted to see her when he returned. He told her they needed to talk. The message was never returned. Back in Chicago, Naomi listened to that voicemail 3 times. Tears filled her eyes as she sat alone on her couch. The warmth in his voice did not sound like a man who had chosen someone else. It did not sound like a man walking away. For the first time, doubt entered her assumptions. Perhaps Margaret had manipulated more than she realized. Perhaps things were not what they seemed. Determined to speak with Alexander directly, Naomi called his office the following morning. An assistant answered politely and explained that he was in meetings all day. She left another message. No response came. 2 days later, she tried again. This time, she learned he had departed for Europe unexpectedly. Frustration and exhaustion settled over her. Every path seemed blocked. Every attempt ended in another delay. Then the final blow arrived. Late one afternoon, a courier delivered a package to her apartment. Inside was a copy of a financial magazine featuring Alexander and the same business heirs from the photograph. The accompanying article praised their growing professional relationship and speculated about a future engagement. Tucked inside the magazine was a handwritten note. The world already sees the future. Do not stand in its way. Naomi immediately recognized the message for what it was. Margaret. No signature was necessary. The implication felt clear. Whether true or not, someone wanted Naomi to believe she no longer belonged in Alexander's life. That night she sat at her dining room table staring at the ultrasound photograph. Her hand rested gently against her stomach. The tiny life growing inside her had done nothing wrong. Whatever uncertainty existed between adults, the child deserved stability. The child deserved peace. For hours she wrestled with impossible choices. Part of her wanted to keep fighting. Part of her wanted to demand answers. Yet another part had become exhausted by doors that would not open. Near midnight, she finally reached a decision. Not because she stopped loving Alexander. Quite the opposite. She loved him enough to stop allowing uncertainty to define her future. The following week, Naomi resigned from her position in Chicago. She accepted an opportunity with a nonprofit organization in a small Illinois town several hours away. The role offered modest pay and little prestige, but it provided something she desperately needed. Distance. A chance to begin again. Before leaving, she wrote Alexander a letter. Every emotion she could not express during months of confusion poured onto the pages. She told him about the baby. She told him about her fears. She told him she had never stopped believing in the man she fell in love with. Most importantly, she told him she hoped one day he would find happiness, even if that future no longer included her. When she finished, she placed the letter inside an envelope addressed to his private office. Then she mailed it. Naomi never knew the letter would never reach him. She never knew it would disappear before arriving in his hands. She never knew other messages had suffered the same fate. All she knew was that one chapter of her life was ending. On a cool autumn morning, carrying only a few suitcases and a heart full of unanswered questions, Naomi drove away from Chicago. The city skyline slowly faded in her rearview mirror. Ahead waited uncertainty. Behind remained the life she thought she would have. As the highway stretched toward the horizon beneath a gray sky, Naomi whispered a promise to the child growing inside her. No matter what happened next, she would protect him, even if she had to do it alone. Back in the present, the questions surrounding Naomi and Elijah refused to leave Alexander alone. Days passed after the charity gala, yet every attempt to return to normal failed. Board meetings blurred together. Investor presentations felt unimportant. Even the constant demands of Sterling Global no longer carried the same urgency. Somewhere beyond financial reports and corporate obligations existed a truth that seemed increasingly impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while reviewing correspondence from the Sterling Children's Foundation, Alexander noticed an invitation to a regional youth science and innovation fair sponsored by several educational organizations. Hundreds of students would be presenting projects. As he scanned the participant list, one name immediately caught his attention. Elijah Carter. Alexander stared at the page for several seconds before quietly setting it aside. By the end of the day, he had rearranged his schedule. The science fair occupied a large community center outside Chicago. Bright banners hung from the ceiling. Rows of exhibits filled the enormous hall. Students proudly stood beside inventions, research projects, and creative displays while parents, teachers, and judges moved through the crowd. The atmosphere felt energetic and hopeful. Children spoke passionately about ideas that might improve neighborhoods, schools, and communities. Alexander arrived without media attention or public announcements. Dressed more casually than usual, he hoped to observe quietly. It did not take long to find Elijah. The boy stood beside a detailed environmental engineering project focused on water conservation systems for community gardens. Judges listened carefully as Elijah explained his design. His confidence immediately impressed everyone around him. He answered difficult questions thoughtfully and never appeared intimidated by adults. Alexander remained several yards away, watching. Once again, the similarities were impossible to miss. Not just physical resemblance. Something deeper. The way Elijah concentrated. The way he listened before responding. The way curiosity seemed to guide every conversation. Hours passed before a natural opportunity appeared. During a break between judging sessions, Students gathered near a refreshment area while volunteers prepared the next round of presentations. Elijah stood alone reviewing notes inside a small notebook. Alexander took a breath and walked over. That was an impressive presentation. Elijah looked up and immediately recognized him. His face brightened. Mr. Sterling. Alexander smiled. Looks like we keep running into each other. Elijah laughed softly. I guess we do. The conversation began simply enough. They discussed the science fair, engineering ideas, and community projects. Elijah spoke enthusiastically about solving practical problems rather than creating inventions simply for attention. Alexander found himself genuinely enjoying the exchange. The boy possessed intelligence, but more importantly, humility. Several times Elijah credited teachers and mentors for helping him improve his project. That quality reminded Alexander of someone else. Naomi. After a while, Elijah pointed toward a large display board. Do you want to see the updated version? Alexander nodded. Together they walked through the exhibit. Elijah explained modifications he had made since winning the award at the charity gala. His excitement felt contagious. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself discussing ideas rather than business strategies. He asked questions. Elijah answered eagerly. Time seemed to disappear. Eventually, a volunteer announced that judging would resume shortly. Students began returning to their assigned areas. Before leaving, Elijah hesitated for a moment. Can I ask you something? Alexander smiled. Of course. The boy looked slightly uncertain. How did you know what you wanted to do when you were younger? The question caught Alexander off guard. He considered the answer carefully. Honestly, I did not. Elijah seemed surprised. Really? Alexander nodded. I thought I knew. But life changes. Sometimes the things that matter most are not what you expected. Elijah reflected on that quietly. Then he smiled. My mom says something similar. The mention of Naomi immediately pulled Alexander's attention back. Your mother sounds very wise. Elijah grinned proudly. She is. There was no hesitation in the answer. No uncertainty. Just admiration. Alexander felt an unexpected emotion stir inside him. Over the years, he had received awards, recognition, and praise from countless people. Yet hearing a child speak so highly of his mother somehow felt more meaningful than any public achievement. Moments later, Elijah glanced across the room and waved. Alexander followed his gaze. Naomi had just entered the community center. She carried a folder beneath one arm and wore the same calm confidence Alexander remembered from the gala. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the crowded hall. Neither looked away immediately. Then Elijah smiled and hurried toward her. Alexander remained where he stood, watching mother and son reunite. As Naomi placed a hand gently on Elijah's shoulder and listened to him excitedly describe the afternoon, Alexander felt the mystery growing deeper than ever before. Because the more time he spent around the boy, the harder it became to believe coincidence had anything to do with what he was seeing. The science fair ended late that afternoon, but Alexander Sterling did not leave immediately. Long after students began packing their displays and families filtered toward the exits, he remained inside the community center watching Naomi and Elijah from a distance. Something about their interaction fascinated him, not because it appeared unusual, but because it felt so natural. Elijah spoke animatedly about the competition, while Naomi listened with complete attention. Every achievement mattered to her. Every detail received genuine interest. Alexander had attended enough events over the years to recognize when parents were distracted by phones, conversations, or obligations. Naomi was different. When Elijah spoke, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Volunteers folded tables. Judges collected paperwork. Families drifted into the parking lot beneath the soft glow of evening sunlight. Alexander finally made his way toward the exit. As he stepped outside, he noticed Elijah sitting alone on a nearby bench, while Naomi spoke with event organizers several yards away. The boy appeared absorbed in a small notebook resting on his lap. Before Alexander could reconsider, he walked over. Elijah looked up and smiled. Mr. Sterling. Alexander nodded. Looks like another successful day. Elijah grinned. I got second place. Congratulations. The boy shrugged modestly. The first place project was really good. The response made Alexander laugh softly. Most children would have focused on disappointment. Elijah seemed genuinely happy for another student. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Alexander noticed the notebook. What are you working on? Elijah immediately brightened. Ideas. He opened the notebook and revealed pages filled with sketches, notes, diagrams, and observations. Some pages contained engineering concepts. Others featured drawings of community gardens and water systems. Alexander flipped through them carefully. The creativity impressed him. Yet one page captured his attention for a completely different reason. Tucked between project sketches was an old photograph. The image showed Naomi standing beside a younger version of herself several years earlier. Alexander recognized the picture instantly. It had been taken during one of the community events they attended together near the beginning of their relationship. His pulse quickened. Elijah noticed his reaction. That is my favorite picture of my mom. Alexander looked at him carefully. Where did you get it? Elijah smiled. She keeps old memories in a box at home. Sometimes she lets me look through it. Alexander returned the photograph gently. You must enjoy hearing stories about her. Elijah nodded enthusiastically. She has a lot of stories. Then his expression became more thoughtful. Some she does not tell very often. The statement lingered between them. Alexander chose his next question carefully. Like what? Elijah glanced down at the notebook. Before me. The answer surprised him. What do you mean? Elijah shrugged. Sometimes when she thinks nobody is looking, she stares at old pictures. His voice remained innocent, unaware of the significance of what he was saying. She gets quiet, like she is remembering something important. Alexander felt a knot tighten inside his chest. Have you ever asked her about it? Elijah nodded. A few times. What does she say? The boy smiled faintly. She says everybody has chapters in their life that help make them who they are. The answer sounded exactly like something Naomi would say. Wise, honest, protective. For several seconds, Alexander remained silent. Then Elijah reached into the back pocket of the notebook and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is my favorite thing in the memory box. Before Alexander could respond, the boy unfolded it. It appeared to be part of an old letter. Time had faded portions of the ink, but several lines remained visible. Elijah pointed proudly. I like how it sounds. Alexander accepted the paper carefully. His eyes moved across the handwritten words. My greatest hope is that one day you understand how much you are loved. The handwriting looked familiar. Very familiar. His heart began racing. Then he noticed something else. Near the bottom of the page sat an incomplete signature. Only part of the name remained visible because the paper had been torn years earlier. Yet enough remained for him to recognize the first letter. Elijah smiled. I think it was somebody important to my mom. Before Alexander could respond, Naomi approached. The moment her eyes landed on the paper in his hands, something changed in her expression. Not panic, not fear, recognition. She immediately understood what Elijah had shown him. Gently, she took the letter fragment and folded it. That belongs in the memory box. Elijah nodded apologetically. Sorry. Naomi smiled warmly at her son. It is okay. Then her eyes met Alexander's. The silence between them carried years of unanswered questions. Neither spoke. Yet for the first time, Alexander felt certain of one thing. Somewhere in Naomi's past existed a truth she had spent years protecting. And somehow, piece by piece, that truth was beginning to reveal itself. The fragment of the letter stayed in Alexander Sterling's thoughts long after he left the community center. Driving back toward downtown Chicago beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and purple, he replayed every detail from the afternoon. The photograph, the unfinished signature, Naomi's reaction when she saw the paper in his hands. None of it felt accidental. For the first time since the charity gala, he felt closer to the truth than ever before. Yet the closer he came, the more complicated everything seemed. That evening, unable to ignore the growing questions, Alexander returned to his penthouse and opened a storage cabinet he had not touched in years. Inside sat several boxes containing personal correspondence, old journals, photographs, and mementos from different chapters of his life. Dust covered some of the lids. Others remained exactly where he had placed them after Naomi disappeared. For nearly 2 hours, he sorted through memories. Concert tickets, holiday cards, photographs from community events. Then, near the bottom of one box, he found a collection of letters he had written years earlier but never mailed. Some had been written during business trips when he missed Naomi. Others contained plans, ideas, and dreams they once discussed together. Reading them felt like opening a window into a version of himself he barely recognized. A younger man. A happier man. Then he noticed something unusual. Among the letters sat several empty envelopes addressed to Naomi's old apartment. All had been returned unopened. The postal markings indicated they were undeliverable. Alexander frowned. He remembered receiving those envelopes years ago. At the time, he assumed Naomi had simply moved without leaving a forwarding address. Tonight, however, the memory felt different. The timing no longer seemed random. The next morning, he called Benjamin Foster. Within hours, the attorney arrived carrying a notebook and an expression that suggested he already knew this conversation would be serious. Alexander explained everything. The gala, Elijah, the science fair, the letter fragment. Benjamin listened carefully. When Alexander finished, silence settled over the room. Finally, Benjamin leaned back. What are you really asking? Alexander stared out the window. I want to know what happened 8 years ago. Benjamin nodded slowly. Then stop looking at the present and start looking at the disappearance. The advice sounded simple, yet it immediately shifted Alexander's thinking. For years he accepted Naomi's disappearance as a painful mystery. He had never investigated it deeply because there seemed nothing left to investigate. She was gone. End of story. Now he wondered whether the story had never truly ended. Over the following week, Alexander began reviewing records from that period. Travel schedules, emails, archived communications. He searched for anything unusual. At first, nothing stood out. Then one evening, while reviewing old corporate correspondence, he noticed a series of meetings he did not remember requesting. Several had been scheduled by his mother's office during the exact weeks Naomi vanished. The discovery alone proved nothing. Margaret Sterling managed countless responsibilities connected to family foundations and corporate interests. Yet the timing felt impossible to ignore. Curious, Alexander requested archived visitor logs from Sterling Global Headquarters. The records arrived the following afternoon. As he scanned page after page, one entry immediately caught his attention. Naomi Carter. Visitor request denied. The date matched a week after she met with Margaret. Alexander stared at the screen. Confusion quickly gave way to disbelief. Naomi had attempted to visit him. He never knew. He continued reading. Additional entries appeared. Phone messages logged, but never forwarded. Appointment requests canceled before reaching his calendar. The pattern became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Someone had been intercepting communication. His pulse quickened. For years he believed Naomi chose silence. Now evidence suggested something entirely different. Late that evening, he drove to his mother's estate outside the city. The sprawling property sat behind iron gates surrounded by carefully maintained gardens and towering trees. Margaret welcomed him into the library with her usual composure. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. Everything appeared peaceful, yet Alexander felt none of that peace. After a few moments of polite conversation, he placed a folder on the coffee table between them. Margaret glanced at it without touching it. "What is this?" she asked. Alexander held her gaze. A question. For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not fear. Recognition. He opened the folder and revealed copies of the visitor logs. The denied requests. The missing messages. The records from 8 years earlier. Silence filled the room. Outside, evening rain tapped gently against the windows. Margaret lowered her eyes briefly toward the documents. Then she looked back at her son. Neither spoke for several seconds. The years between them suddenly felt very long. Finally, Alexander asked the question that had haunted him since seeing Elijah for the first time. "What did you do?" The question lingered in the library long after Alexander asked it. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows, while the fire cast warm shadows across shelves filled with decades of family history. Margaret Sterling sat motionless for several seconds. The confidence she carried so effortlessly throughout most situations seemed slightly diminished now. Not shattered, not defeated, simply burdened by something she had spent years refusing to confront. Alexander remained standing beside the coffee table. The visitor logs lay open between them. So did the records of intercepted messages. Each document represented a piece of a puzzle that was finally beginning to form a complete picture. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the papers before speaking. "You think I caused all of this?" Her voice sounded calm, but not dismissive. Alexander folded his arms. "I think Naomi tried to reach me." Silence. "I think someone made sure she could not." Margaret exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, she looked less like the powerful matriarch of a corporate dynasty and more like a mother facing a painful consequence. You were building something important. Alexander stared at her. That is not an answer. She looked toward the fireplace. It was the answer I believed mattered. The statement hung heavily between them. Margaret rose from her chair and walked toward the window overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass. 8 years ago, everything was changing. Investors were watching. Expansion plans were underway. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Alexander felt frustration building. So you decided my personal life was a problem to solve? Margaret remained silent for a moment. Then she nodded. The honesty stunned him more than denial would have. I convinced myself I was protecting you. The words sounded sincere. That somehow made them worse. Alexander looked away briefly. Did you know she was pregnant? Another pause followed. Longer this time. Margaret closed her eyes. Yes. The answer struck with the weight of a confession. Alexander felt the room tilt beneath him. For several seconds he could not speak. The reality was suddenly undeniable. His mother had known. She had known about the child. Known about Naomi. Known about everything. Yet she had allowed 8 years to pass in silence. You knew? His voice sounded distant. Margaret turned slowly. Regret now occupied her expression fully. I learned during our meeting. Alexander struggled to process the admission. And you still did it. She nodded once. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she made no effort to hide them. I told myself the timing was wrong. I told myself your future would be destroyed. I told myself I was protecting generations of work. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. The problem with fear is that it can disguise itself as wisdom. Alexander said nothing. He could not. Margaret continued. I arranged meetings. I blocked messages. I made sure communication became difficult. The words arrived steadily now. One truth after another. Years of secrecy unraveling in real time. I never expected her to disappear completely. Alexander felt anger rising. Not explosive anger. Something quieter. More painful. You offered her money. Margaret lowered her gaze. Yes. The admission filled the room. Rain continued falling outside. The fire crackled softly nearby. Yet neither sound seemed capable of softening the truth. Did she take it? Alexander asked. Margaret shook her head immediately. No. Surprise flashed across his face. For the first time, something resembling admiration touched Margaret's expression. That woman had more integrity than I gave her credit for. The statement carried genuine respect. Alexander thought about Naomi. The years she spent raising Elijah alone. The nonprofit she built. The life she created without help. Everything suddenly made more sense. Margaret returned to her chair. Her shoulders seemed heavier now. Older somehow. I spent years convincing myself the outcome justified the choice. She looked directly at her son. Then I saw you at that gala. Alexander remained silent. I watched you look at that boy. Her voice softened. And I realized I had not protected you at all. The room fell quiet again. For the first time since arriving, Alexander saw something he never expected to see in his mother. Regret. Real regret. Not for being caught. For being wrong. Eventually, Margaret reached into a drawer beside the fireplace and removed a small bundle tied together with a faded ribbon. She carried it to the table and placed it carefully in front of him. Alexander frowned. What is this? Her eyes filled with sadness. The messages. Slowly, he untied the ribbon. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed in Naomi's handwriting. Others returned unopened. Years of words that never reached their destination. Alexander stared at the stack in disbelief. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the top envelope. The truth he had been chasing was finally sitting directly in front of him. And somewhere within those pages waited the answer to everything. Alexander did not leave his mother's estate until well after midnight. The stack of letters sat beside him on the passenger seat during the drive back to Chicago, untouched at first because he was not certain he was ready to face what they contained. Years of unanswered questions rested inside those envelopes. Years of assumptions. Years of pain. By the time he reached his penthouse, the city below shimmered beneath thousands of lights, but Alexander barely noticed. He carried the letters into his office and placed them carefully on the desk. For several minutes, he simply stared at them. Then he opened the first envelope. Naomi's handwriting immediately pulled him back through time. The letter had been written only days after she left Chicago. She described confusion, heartbreak, and uncertainty. She wrote that she did not understand why communication had suddenly become impossible. She wrote that she hoped he was happy, even if he had chosen a different future. Most importantly, she wrote that she was carrying their child. Alexander closed his eyes. The words felt almost impossible to absorb. 8 years. 8 years separated him from the moment he should have known. He opened another letter, then another. Each revealed more of Naomi's journey. She never sounded bitter, never cruel, never accusatory. Instead, the letters revealed determination, fear, hope, strength. She described doctor appointments, sleepless nights, the excitement of hearing a heartbeat for the first time, the anxiety of preparing to become a mother alone. She wrote about every milestone because she believed one day he might read them. She believed he deserved to know. Tears gathered in Alexander's eyes as he continued reading. One letter contained a sonogram photograph. Another described Elijah's birth. Naomi wrote about holding him for the first time and seeing traces of Alexander in his tiny features. She wrote that she whispered stories about his father while rocking him to sleep. Not stories about wealth or success. Stories about kindness, curiosity, generosity, the qualities she loved most. By dawn, Alexander had read every letter. The truth was complete now. Naomi had never hidden Elijah from him out of malice. She believed he had chosen another life. She believed she was protecting herself and her son from rejection. The realization broke something inside him. Not because of anger, because of grief. Grief for years that could never be recovered. Later that afternoon, Alexander drove to the community education center Naomi had built. The building buzzed with activity as children participated in after-school programs and volunteers organized community projects. Through the glass entrance doors, he spotted Naomi speaking with a group of parents. She looked exactly as she had during the gala and the science fair. Strong, calm, certain. Yet now he understood the cost behind that strength. When the meeting ended, Naomi noticed him waiting near the lobby. For a moment, neither moved. Then she quietly excused herself and walked toward him. They stepped outside into a small courtyard surrounded by flower beds and benches. Autumn sunlight filtered through the trees overhead. The air carried the first hints of approaching winter. Naomi folded her arms gently. You found answers. It was not a question. Alexander nodded. My mother told me everything. Pain flickered briefly across Naomi's face. Not surprise. Recognition. Then you know. He looked at her for several seconds before speaking. I know you tried to reach me. Naomi lowered her eyes. Many times. I know about the letters. Her expression softened immediately. Years of emotion seemed to pass silently between them. Alexander reached into his coat and carefully removed one of the envelopes. Naomi recognized it instantly. You kept them? She asked quietly. Alexander shook his head. I never received them. The words carried more weight than any accusation. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, tears glistened in the corners. For years, she had carried the belief that he chose silence. In a single moment, that belief disappeared. They sat together on a nearby bench. Slowly, patiently, they shared the missing pieces of the story. Naomi described her meeting with Margaret. The envelope of money. The unanswered calls. The misleading messages. Alexander explained the blocked communications and hidden records. Neither interrupted, neither blamed. The truth itself was painful enough. As the conversation continued, another figure emerged from the building carrying a backpack and several notebooks. Elijah. The boy spotted them immediately. Surprise crossed his face. Then curiosity. Naomi looked toward her son. Alexander followed her gaze. For a brief moment, all three remained connected by a silence that felt strangely important. The years of misunderstanding had finally ended. What remained was something much more difficult. Deciding what came next. The months that followed did not erase the past. They could not restore birthdays that had been missed, school events that had passed, or years that had disappeared beneath misunderstanding and silence. Yet something important began to happen. The truth, once hidden, finally had room to breathe. Alexander Sterling made a decision that surprised many people around him. For the first time in his adult life, he stopped trying to solve every problem with speed. He understood that trust could not be rebuilt through money, influence, or grand gestures. It would require something far more difficult. Consistency. So he started with small things. He attended Elijah's school science presentations. He showed up for community volunteer days organized by Naomi's nonprofit. He answered questions honestly when they were asked and remained patient when they were not. At first, the relationship felt cautious. Understandably so. Elijah knew Alexander as a successful businessman he had met at several events. The deeper truth required time to process. Naomi believed the decision belonged to her son. When the moment felt right, she sat with him one quiet evening inside their living room. Rain tapped gently against the windows while a lamp cast warm light across the room. Slowly and carefully, she explained everything. The story was not presented as a tragedy. It was presented as the truth. She told Elijah about two people who loved each other. She told him about misunderstandings created by others. She told him about letters that never arrived and conversations that never happened. Most importantly, she made one thing clear. He had always been loved. By both of them. Elijah listened quietly. The maturity he had shown throughout his young life appeared once again. He asked thoughtful questions. Some were difficult. Some carried sadness. Others carried curiosity. Naomi answered everyone honestly. When the conversation ended, Elijah remained silent for several minutes. Then he asked a simple question. Did he know about me? Naomi shook her head. No. Elijah looked down at his hands. After a long pause, he nodded. Something seemed to settle inside him. Not complete understanding, but acceptance. A few days later, Alexander met Elijah at a neighborhood park. Autumn leaves covered the walking paths, while children played nearby. Neither seemed entirely certain how to begin the conversation. Finally, Elijah broke the silence. Mom told me everything. Alexander felt his heartbeat quicken. She did. Elijah nodded. You did not know. The statement was not accusatory. Just factual. Alexander looked at him carefully. No, I did not. Elijah considered that for a moment. Then he asked the question Alexander feared most. Would you have wanted to know? The answer came immediately. More than anything. The sincerity in his voice carried years of regret. Elijah studied him for several seconds before offering a small smile. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Over time, beginnings became routines. Routines became memories. Alexander helped with school projects, attended educational programs, listened to stories about science competitions and community initiatives. The more time he spent with Elijah, the more grateful he became for the person Naomi had raised. Intelligence, kindness, humility, character. None of those qualities appeared by accident. They reflected years of love and guidance. One spring morning, nearly a year after the charity gala, families gathered for Elijah's elementary school graduation ceremony. The school auditorium overflowed with parents, teachers, relatives, and friends. Colorful decorations lined the walls. Students adjusted their graduation gowns while excited conversations filled the room. Near the front sat Naomi. Beside her sat Alexander. Not separated by confusion. Not divided by secrets. Simply present. When Elijah's name was called, applause filled the auditorium. He crossed the stage confidently, accepted his certificate, and smiled toward the audience. For a brief moment, his eyes found Naomi, then Alexander. Pride reflected in both faces. After the ceremony ended, families gathered outside beneath bright spring sunshine. Photographs were taken. Teachers offered congratulations. Children laughed while celebrating the beginning of summer. Elijah stood between Naomi and Alexander for a picture. As the camera flashed, Alexander felt something he had not experienced in years. Peace. Not because everything was perfect. Some losses could never be recovered. But because the future no longer belonged to regret. A short distance away, Margaret Sterling watched quietly. Age seemed to have softened her over the past year. She understood that some mistakes never fully disappear. Yet she had spent months supporting Naomi's nonprofit anonymously and working to repair what she could. It was not redemption. It was responsibility. As the afternoon sun illuminated the school courtyard, Elijah slipped naturally between Naomi and Alexander. One hand reached for his mother. The other reached for his father. Neither adult spoke. They did not need to. The truth had finally found its way home. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the future ahead of them felt larger than the past behind them.